Good afternoon. I'm going to be talking today a bit about metaphors, in particular metaphors for multiculturalism. I like metaphors. They create powerful images that influence how we see the world and also how we act in different situations. So say, for example, boy, the upcoming negotiation with this car salesman is going to be a real battle. Or the two companies courted each other in a ritual mating dance in the months preceding the highly publicized international merger. Right? They create a picture in our head and we can really understand what's going on. Well, I study cultural and diversity, and there are a few metaphors out there for multiculturalism floating around. The most common ones are the melting pot and a cultural mosaic. And today I'm going to tell you about my personal journey trying to understand different cultures and how we're the same and how we're different. And I'm going to propose to you a new metaphor for multiculturalism that I'm going to challenge you to think about and change your perspective on the multicultural world that we live in. So as I mentioned, I study culture. I became interested in studying culture when I was in high school. I always loved languages. I studied Latin and French and Spanish. And going into high school, I heard that I would have the opportunity to take Russian as well if I wanted to, and I jumped at that opportunity. And my Russian teacher, he taught us not only a new alphabet and a new language, but he gave us a view inside what was then a very closed and secretive 1984 Soviet Russia. We learned about people who drank tea that was prepared with water boiled in a samovar that was heated with birch branches. We learned about people who ate caviar by the spoonful with their blini. And we learned about a people who were warm and communal, incredibly hardworking, and very proud. And as I learned about these people, I thought, man, they are so different from me, so different from how we are over in the West. And this is a very common experience people have. When you meet someone from another culture, the first thing you notice are differences, how we're different. Well, in 1986, there was a tragedy in Chernobyl, a nuclear tragedy, because then Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev had instituted a policy of glasnost, openness. For the first time, Western reporters had access to what was a very tragic event in the Soviet Union. And we were able to read coverage and see photographs of people dealing with this tragedy, families facing loss and uncertainty. And as I saw that side of the people in the Soviet Union, I started thinking, maybe they're not so different from me and from us over here in the West. Just like us, there are people, and they are celebrating the joys of life, and they're facing the tragedies and the challenges of life, relying on each other for support. Maybe they are just like us. And for me, that started a question and a journey. I wanted to understand in what ways are people from different cultures the same, and in what ways are they different. Now, there are a couple metaphors out there that describe what happens when people from different cultures come together in a multicultural society. One of the most common ones that I grew up with is the melting pot. So this is a metaphor that says when you get people from different cultures together in a society, they're like ingredients in a stew. And if you put it over a fire and stir it up, then everything sort of melts into one another, and you get something really yummy and warm, and it's more than the sum of its parts. So this metaphor makes us think about diversity as there are differences, but when combined, we can become the same. Some people talk about diversity and multiculturalism as a salad, the multicultural salad. I like this metaphor because it suggests that, well, certainly we as people are fresher and crisper and more colorful than the stew ingredients. And it also suggests that even if you put us all in a bowl together and toss us around, we're still going to maintain our individual uniqueness, our cultural heritage. Our colors make up this colorful salad. I didn't really question these metaphors until I went to Russia myself. So In university, I majored in Russian language. I did a business minor, and I went on a study abroad trip to Russia. And I challenged myself to spend the 4 months I was there really trying to learn about the Russian people and in what ways were similar and in what ways were different. I remember the first day we got there, and we were riding in a bus, the group of students, we were riding in a bus on the way to the dormitory. We were packed like sardines in this bus, and I was smushed up against people who looked different, they talked differently, they smelled different. They were so different from me. And we got to the dormitory, and our group leader took us across the street to the market, where we were going to have to buy our food every day for the next 4 months. So he was showing us how to do that. The shelves were practically bare. In the back of the store, there was a frozen bin, and it had 6 chickens in it. And I remember looking at the chickens. They weren't pink and plump and wrapped in shiny plastic packaging like I was used to. They were stretched out and yellow and skinny. There was hardly any meat on them, and just lying there without any packaging at all, frozen in this bin. And they still had feet. We went to the front of the store, and our group leader distributed coupons for us. Every week, we had weekly rations of sugar and eggs and milk. Those were the items that were in deficit at the time, and you could only buy with coupons. Unfortunately, we didn't get coupons for toilet paper, which was also in deficit at the time, but that's a different story. The point is, by the end of that first day, I was convinced that these people and the life over here in Russia is so different from the West. I was convinced that we're very different. And that if we're going to talk about how people come together from different cultures in a multicultural society, we need a metaphor that captures those differences, that distinctiveness of people from different cultural heritages. So the cultural mosaic does that. It's a great metaphor, a wonderful part of Canadian ideology that I'm a big fan of. And what does this metaphor tell us? Well, it tells us that each individual is like a tile in a mosaic, bright, colorful, and an individual that can maintain their own uniqueness even within the broader society. So if we stand back and look at a mosaic, we can see the big picture, and the individuals are no longer so clear who's who, the individual tiles. And we see a masterpiece, again, something that's greater than the sum of its parts, something beautiful. What does it tell us about the world? The cultural mosaic metaphor influences how we see the world in a diverse community, because it tells us that people can be part of the same community but maintain their individual distinctiveness, whether that be culture or whatever makes them an individual. So it's a nice, powerful metaphor capturing differences within a community. Now back to my 4 months in Russia. Over time, I started to meet many Russians, students who invited me into their homes, with warmth and hospitality and always a meticulously prepared meal. My Russian language got better, and I was able to communicate with people and talk about all sorts of things: government, politics, economics, our favorite movies. And through these conversations, I started thinking again, maybe we're not so different. Maybe we are the same. Just like over here in the West, there are people who want a strong government, and there are people who are more liberal. People are proud of their nation's history, of their nation's art. People like to chit-chat about the weather. So maybe we are all the same. And you'll never guess what happened next. Well, I fell in love with one of these Soviet Russians. And a year later, I brought him back to the West as my fiancé. And before you do this on your study abroad trip, I have to warn you, it is, in fact, every parent's nightmare. So your fiancé, your 20-year-old fiancé from halfway around the world, may not immediately be opened into your family with open arms. But before long, my husband was welcomed into my family in the West. And also before long, I started thinking that this Russian from halfway around the world, who I thought was just like me, was so not just like me. So over here in the West, all of a sudden, his Russianness became so much more apparent in everything he said and everything he did, right? And it wasn't just the obvious things like eating buckwheat kasha or looking for mushrooms every time we go for a walk in the woods. It was more subtle things, like his fatalism, his view of the role of work in life, the role of material goods. And so I started realizing we are the same, but we're also different. And I started realizing that the way we notice similarities and differences in others isn't only a function of how well we know the person or how long we know them, but it's also a function of the perspective we're taking, where we are when we're meeting that person. And all of those things can influence who the person is that we're perceiving and trying to figure out if they're the same or they're different. So as I mentioned, I study culture in an organizational context. I look at how culture influences things like negotiation, decision-making, conflict management, teamwork. I try to identify the individual tiles in the cultural mosaic. So how each tile is shaped and what happens when people come together in a multicultural workplace, whether people adjust or adapt. And what I've come to find out is that the cultural mosaic metaphor is a little bit too rigid. It's really not as clear-cut as that. Because the cultural mosaic metaphor captures individual uniqueness, but it doesn't capture the fluidity and flexibility of who we are and of who we can be. So I'd like to propose a new metaphor for multiculturalism or for diversity. And that is the metaphor of not a cultural mosaic, but an impressionist painting. In an impressionist painting, each individual is a brushstroke. So they are unique, they are beautiful on their own, but not with sharp edges that are separate from all the other brushstrokes. Rather with rough edges that flow right into the brushstrokes around them and are dynamic and create something beautiful in the larger big picture sense. How does a metaphor like this influence how we see the world? Well, like the mosaic metaphor, it suggests that individuals in a multicultural community can maintain their individual uniqueness, their cultural heritage. But unlike the mosaic metaphor, individuals are not fixed and isolated. Rather, they're flexible and fluid, like we are, learning and changing, influencing others, being influenced by others, adapting to situations and people. And nowhere is this more evident than in the minds and the experiences and the behaviors of bicultural and multicultural individuals. So how can an impressionist painting change the way you see the world? And that's my challenge for you. An impressionist painting allows you to think of multiculturalism not as are we the same or as are we different, but rather multiculturalism as being. Being flexible and fluid and encouraging that in others. Being aware of the context, the theme of the painting. Being who you are and being open to others as they are. Because in the end, it turns out we are the same and we are different. Thank you.